Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're navigating really one of the biggest ecological challenges we face, global biological invasions. We're jumping into some fascinating research that asks a really critical question. Can we actually predict where these invasive species are likely to spread next?
We can. And our source material for this deep dive is a really insightful paper. It's titled Insights from the Past: Invasion Trajectory and Niche Trends of a Global Freshwater Invader. The lead author is Guareschi.
Okay, insights from the past. That tells you something right there. This isn't just about, guessing. It's about checking our predictions against actual history. So what was the main thing the researchers were trying to achieve here?
Well, it was pretty ambitious. They used the invasion history of one really successful species. It's incredibly well documented over a long time to test how reliable our standard prediction tools actually are. We generally call these species distribution models, or SDMs.
Right, SDMs. So for listeners maybe not familiar, when we talk about species distribution models, what are we actually doing? What is an SDM?
Think of it like this. You're creating a kind of digital map of a species' preferred climate. You take all the places where we know the species lives right now, and you look at the environmental conditions there, things like temperature, rainfall, elevation, that sort of thing. Then the model uses that environmental fingerprint to find other places on Earth with similar conditions. That gives you a map of where the species could potentially survive and establish.
And the species they chose to sort of put this whole idea to the test.
They picked the red swamp crayfish, Procambarus clarkii. It's known as a hyper-successful invader, especially in freshwater, and crucially, its spread over the last century is really well recorded. Perfect for this kind of look-back analysis.
Got it. So Guareschi and the team, they essentially had two big questions they were asking history to answer for them.
That's right. First, they wanted to use those SDMs at different points in time. So they asked, okay, if we'd build a model using only the data we had back in, say, 1950, how well would that model have predicted where the crayfish actually showed up by 2022? And second, they wanted to look at the species' realized niche, the actual environmental conditions it uses, and see if that changed, if it evolved, as the crayfish spread around the globe.
Let's just pause on the scale for a second. Why is dealing with biological invasions such a big deal, and why this crayfish in particular?
Well, invasions are, frankly, a defining feature of our current era, the Anthropocene. They're a huge cause of biodiversity loss. They cost economies billions, and prevention is just so key because once an invader gets established, especially in water, getting rid of it is, well, it's incredibly difficult, often impossible. They can be real ecosystem wrecking balls. That makes predicting where they might go next absolutely vital.
And the tools we use for predicting these SDMs, they have a built-in limitation, don't they? A key assumption.
Yes, exactly. Because these models lean so heavily on climate variables like temperature and rainfall, which makes sense for an ectotherm, like a crayfish, whose body temperature depends on the environment they usually have, to assume something called niche conservatism.
Niche conservatism, what are we assuming there?
We're basically assuming the species plays by its old rules, that its climate preferences don't change as it moves into new areas. So if it likes certain temperatures in its native range, say Louisiana, the assumption is it will only thrive in places with similar temperatures in Europe or Asia. But, the stress of invading new places could potentially drive adaptation, maybe broaden its tolerances. And if that happens, our models based on the old niche could be wrong. This paper wanted to test if that assumption actually holds up for a truly global, successful invader.
Okay, let's get a bit more background on this specific invader, P. clarkii. It's farmed, right? Aquaculture value, but ecologically,
Yeah.
not so great.
Oh, it's a classic double-edged sword. Native to the southern U.S. and northeast Mexico. It was first moved outside that range back in the 1920s. Fast forward a century, and it's now in over 40 countries, every continent except Antarctica and Australia. Okay. And the impacts are pretty severe. It hits amphibians, aquatic insects, underwater plants hard. It can even erode riverbanks. And critically, it carries the crayfish plague pathogen. That disease, Aphanomyces astacei, is devastating native crayfish populations, particularly in Europe and Asia.
So a widespread, damaging species with a century-long, well-documented invasion history sounds like the perfect candidate for their method, which brings us to how they did it, using this historical data like a scientific time machine. How did they set up this retrospective test?
Yeah, the methodology is really the core innovation here. They gathered this massive data set, over 54,000 records of where P. clarkii has been found globally, starting from way back in 1854, right up to 2022.
54,000 records, that's an incredible amount of tracking for one species' global journey.
It really is. And what they did was group these records into 4 different time slices,
Mhm.
sort of snapshots of the invasion progress. Everything up to 1950, then up to 1975, up to 2000, and finally the full data set up to 2022. These periods roughly track, the initial slow spread, then the big international boom linked to the crayfish farming industry around the 70s, and then the subsequent massive expansion.
Ah, so this lets them kind of trick the model. They train it using only the old, limited data from an early period, and then they ask that model to predict the future, a future that, from our perspective now, we already know the answer to.
Precisely. So they build an SDM using only the records up to, say, 1950. Then they project that model onto the climate conditions of later periods, 1975, 2000, 2022. This way they could directly check. Did the areas the 1950 model flagged as highly suitable actually match up with where the crayfish really did appear later on?
Yeah.
And they use robust methods, like ensemble modeling, to make sure the results were reliable. The models actually performed very well statistically, giving them confidence.
Okay, so the big reveal. What did this historical experiment share? Did the models actually pass this test? Could they predict the spread?
Yes, that was the core finding, and really a big validation for using SDMs this way. The projections did successfully predict the new areas the crayfish later occupied. In every comparison they made, the model suitability scores for the places the crayfish actually invaded later were significantly higher than for random locations across the globe. The signal was clearly there.
So even those early models, based on limited data, had some predictive power, like a fuzzy crystal ball, maybe. Did the amount of data matter, though?
It definitely did.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets interesting. The models they built using the really early data, like just the 78 records available up to 1950, they tended to underpredict the full eventual range. Essentially, with so few points, the model didn't capture the species' full tolerance, especially for temperature. It needed more examples to learn the limits.
But importantly, even with that underprediction, was the information from those very early models still useful? Could it have guided prevention efforts back then?
Absolutely. And that's maybe the most crucial takeaway for people thinking about early warning systems today. Even those earliest models, based on just a handful of records, they correctly pinpointed areas that would become major invasion hotspots later on. We're talking about parts of Europe, France, Spain, Italy, and East Asia, like Southeast China. The models saw the suitability there decades before the crayfish really took off in those regions.
Wow, that's quite powerful. So you're saying if scientists or managers had run these models using the data available up to 1975, which was still only about 265 records, they would have gotten a pretty decent map and noteworthy projection, as the paper calls it, of where the crayfish is today, especially for Europe.
Exactly. And this is where the study pivots from looking back to looking forward, because the models that successfully predicted the past spread also identified some large, apparently highly suitable regions where P. clarkii hasn't established yet, at least not successfully.
Okay, so where should we be looking now? Which areas are flagged as high risk?
The models highlighted 3 main zones: the Uruguay-Argentina region, particularly around the Rio de la Plata River Basin, parts of Eastern Europe near the Black Sea, and perhaps worryingly for that part of the world, Australasia. This tells us the invasion isn't necessarily over. The crayfish hasn't run out of climatically suitable places to go. The threat's ongoing.
That's incredibly valuable information for conservation groups and biosecurity agencies in those regions.
Wow.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit from the where to the what, from geography to the biology. As this crayfish spread across continents, encountering all sorts of new environments, did it fundamentally change? Did its environmental preferences, its niche, shift over time?
Right, this moves us to their second big question, analyzing the realized niche, the actual environmental conditions the crayfish occupied. And the finding here was, well, pretty striking. It turned out to be a really strong, century-long case for niche conservatism, for stability. The paper describes the niche of P. clarkii as remarkably stable over more than 100 years of invasion.
Remarkably stable. That seems counterintuitive, given its spread from North America to Europe, Asia, Africa. Surely the environments were different.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But statistically, the niche stability metric was very high consistently, between 95% and 99% when they compared different time periods. They detected only very small amounts of niche expansion, less than 5%. It suggests this crayfish, environmentally speaking, has been pretty consistent in what it needs, particularly regarding climate.
And was there one particular environmental factor that stood out as the main driver, the key thing determining where it could or couldn't live?
Yes, annual mean temperature. That came out as the most important variable consistently across all the time periods modeled. It reinforces the view of P. clarkii as basically a warm water species. It has broad thermal tolerance, sure, but temperature is clearly a major defining factor for its potential range.
Now, I want to kind of dig into the details here because you said remarkably stable, like 99% similar. But the authors also mentioned a slight statistical wrinkle, didn't they? Something about niche equivalency versus similarity.
Ah, yes, this is where the science gets, a bit more nuanced, the messy reality. So, while the overall overlap between the niches from different periods was high, around 80%, the strictest statistical test, the one for niche equivalency, wasn't met. Equivalency asks, are these two niches, say the 1950 niche and the 2022 niche, statistically identical? And the answer was technically no. The invasion process did introduce some small but statistically significant differences in the environmental space the crayfish use over time.
Okay, so not perfectly identical clones, but still incredibly alike in practice.
Exactly. That's the key distinction. When they ran a different test, the niche similarity test, which asks, are these niches more similar to each other than you'd expect by random chance? The answer was a clear yes. So it suggests that while there might be tiny shifts, the core climatic requirements remain fundamentally conserved over this long invasion period. It relies heavily on its ancestral preferences and isn't just randomly adapting to completely different climates.
That difference between strict identity and practical similarity, that feels really important for how we interpret these models, right? So if the climate niche was so stable, what explains the incredible speed and the sheer global scale of this invasion? It got everywhere so fast.
And that leads us to probably the biggest implication highlighted in the paper.
Hmm.
The massive role of factors other than climate, non-climatic factors. The researchers noticed something interesting. They tracked the average environmental conditions the species occupied over time, the bioclimatic centroid. And they found that this centroid often shifted in a different direction than how the overall available environment was changing globally.
Wait, so the crayfish was spreading into areas that weren't necessarily the next logical step based purely on the climate map changing. It wasn't just following the climate gradient.
That's the crucial point, the so what moment. It strongly suggests that the hyperexpansion wasn't just driven or even limited by climate alone. Human activities were huge accelerators. Things like repeated introductions for aquaculture, releasing huge numbers of individuals, what scientists call high tropical pressure, and then people moving them around locally. Humans basically gave the crayfish a massive leg up, helping it jump over natural dispersal barriers and bypassing decades of slow natural spread. They effectively short-circuited the process, especially between 1975 and 2000.
So this study really ends up being a powerful endorsement of using these SDMs, especially when you can validate them against historical spread like this for species with good records. It shows that even with that early limited data, you could have gotten useful warnings about large-scale patterns.
Absolutely. And the authors stress that this retrospective validation approach itself is really valuable. It's something we could, and probably should, apply to other well-documented invasive species. It helps build confidence in our tools. In a world that's changing so fast and is so interconnected, checking if our predictive tools actually worked in the past gives us more faith in using them to anticipate the future.
Looking forward then, what did the paper suggest needs to happen next to make these predictions even better?
They really emphasize needing to bring in more than just climate. Future work should try to incorporate data on the species' traits, like its physiology or behavior. We also need to consider biotic interactions. Who does it eat? Who eats it? What diseases does it carry? And of course, its natural ability to disperse on its own. And critically, since it's a freshwater crayfish, we need much better data on where suitable aquatic habitats actually are and how connected they are. That's often a missing piece in purely climate-based models.
Right, getting that more holistic picture of all the factors driving the spread. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it brings us back to those areas the models flagged as suitable but not yet invaded Uruguay, Argentina, Eastern Europe, Australasia. Given what we've learned about this crayfish's stable niche preferences, but also how human activity just turbocharged its past spread.
Yeah, the final thought really has to be for you, the listener, to consider. Given how stable this invader is and how effective humans have been at moving it around, well, how long until human activity inevitably helps it jump the last few geographical hurdles into those vulnerable areas? And maybe more importantly, how quickly can we translate these kinds of predictions into effective action on the ground before that happens?
A critical question indeed, something for all of us to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.